On the 4th of July weekend, at exactly 6:12 in the morning, I canceled a $1,050 monthly transfer while still standing in full uniform outside Fort Carson, boots soaked from a night exercise that had run 19 hours longer than planned. Then I opened a message from my stepmother that read one line: "Don't come home. You'll just make things harder." I stared at it long enough for the words to stop looking like language and start looking like strategy. If you've ever had someone try to erase you quietly instead of confronting you directly, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I read those comments, and I want to know how far this story travels. My name is Marissa Cole. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a logistics specialist in the United States Army. And this is the last time I let my own family treat me like a line item they could delete when it became inconvenient. But before I tell you what I did after that message, you need to understand how my name ended up tied to a property I hadn't seen in 4 years. Because none of what happened next makes sense without that. I grew up in a suburb outside Colorado Springs, not the kind of place that shows up in travel brochures. Just rows of beige houses, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who noticed everything but said nothing directly. My parents divorced when I was 10. No screaming, no broken plates, just paperwork and silence. My mom, Diane Cole, moved into a small townhouse near Academy Boulevard. My dad, Richard Cole, kept the house. For a while, I moved between both. Then slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, I stopped being expected at my dad's place. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of small adjustments. A room that became a guest room. A toothbrush that disappeared from the bathroom. A seat at the table that stopped being set automatically. You don't notice it at first. Then one day you realize you're visiting a place that used to be yours. When I was 16, my dad remarried. Her name was Vanessa Cole. I'm not going to call her evil. That would be too simple. Vanessa was organized, strategic, calm in a way that made everything she did look reasonable. And that's what made her dangerous. She didn't push me out. She just rearranged the space until there wasn't room left. My mom died 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed late. I got 8 days of emergency leave. 8 days to sit in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and listen to machines that never quite matched the rhythm of her breathing. I didn't make it back in time for the funeral. That's something I carried differently than most things. I enlisted at 20, not because I was escaping something, because I needed structure, a clear system where effort led to results, where showing up mattered, where things were defined. I worked my way up. Promotions came slowly, but they came. And for a while, I kept trying to stay connected to my dad. Phone calls, texts, holiday check-ins. That part didn't last. 4 years ago, he called me out of nowhere. Not to ask how I was, not to check in. He called because he needed something. At the time, I didn't recognize the pattern. Now I do. He and Vanessa wanted to buy a new house. Bigger, newer. Better school district for my half-sister Lila. The house they had wasn't enough anymore. The problem was his credit score, somewhere around 640. Combined income that looked fine on paper, but didn't meet the lender's preferred threshold for the rate they wanted. The best offer they had was 7.6%. Over 30 years, that difference was tens of thousands of dollars. My aunt, Judith Carter, my mom's older sister, is a real estate attorney. She called me 2 days after my dad did. She explained everything clearly. If you co-sign, she said, the rate drops to 5.1%. You would hold 35% equity in the property. She didn't pressure me. She laid out the risks. If they default, your credit is hit. If they sell, you're entitled to your share. If anything happens legally, you are on that contract. She gave me 5 days to think. I said yes. Not because I trusted the situation completely, but because I understood something. If my name was on that deed, I wasn't just a daughter. I was a legal stakeholder. We closed that summer. Purchase price? $265,000. My name sat right under his on the co-borrower line. 35% ownership. At the same time, I set up an automatic allotment, $1,050 a month, pulled directly from my military pay, sent into the account tied to the mortgage. That covered roughly 45% of the monthly payment. Every month, on time, no exceptions. For the first 6 months, my dad called occasionally. Short conversations. Thanks. Updates about the house. Small talk. Then the calls slowed. Then they stopped. I kept sending the money, month after month. I told myself it was normal. People get busy. Families drift. That's what I believed. What I didn't know was what was happening inside that house, while I was sending nearly half the mortgage every month. My grandmother, Evelyn Carter, stayed with them part of the year. She was 81, sharp mind, weak knees. Relied on whoever handed her the phone. I must have called that house at least 40 times over 4 years. Vanessa answered most of them. She's resting. She's asleep. She's not feeling well. I'll tell her you called. I believed her. I didn't know until much later that my grandmother never received a single message. Not one. My half-sister Lila texted me once, just once, asking if I was coming for Thanksgiving. I replied within 20 minutes. She never answered. I found out later Vanessa had seen the message and deleted the conversation. My dad told extended family I was distant, that I didn't call, that I was too busy with the military to stay connected. And here's the thing about lies like that. If nobody challenges them, they become the version everyone accepts. 3 months before that 4th of July message, my dad walked into a Keller Williams office, sat down with a listing agent named Paul Henderson. I didn't know that at the time. I'm telling you now because it matters. Because that meeting is the reason I got that message. Home values in that area had increased significantly. The house they bought for $265,000 was now estimated around $390,000. There was money sitting in that property. A lot of it. Vanessa's boutique business had been losing money for over a year, around $22,000 in debt. Lila was about to start college. Expenses were stacking. The solution was simple. Sell the house, clear the debt, start fresh. The problem was me, my name, my 35%. Legally, they couldn't sell without me. So instead of calling me, instead of negotiating, they chose something else. Distance, silence, control. And then, when the timing was right, that message. Don't come home. You'll just make things harder. I sat on a metal bench outside the barracks and read it again. Then I typed one word. Understood. And I hit send before I could write anything else. Here's something the Army teaches you early. You don't respond emotionally to bad positioning. You adjust. Quietly. I pulled out my laptop, opened my pay system, canceled the allotment, effective immediately. $1,050 a month. Stopped. Then I drafted a single document, an equity position request to the lender. Standard, legal, unavoidable. Sent at 6:38 a.m. No threats, no accusations. Just a question. Where do I stand? 2 days later, my dad's phone rang 7 times. One of those calls came from an attorney he didn't hire. And that's when everything he thought he had under control started to crack. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already booked a flight home 3 months earlier, and I was already on my way. Labor Day weekend, 3 months before that message ever showed up on my phone, I booked a one-way ticket home that cost $427 and chose a seat near the back of the plane where nobody would try to talk to me. I didn't tell anyone, not my dad, not Vanessa, not even my grandmother, because by that point, I already felt something was off. I just didn't have proof yet. If you've ever had that feeling, where everything looks normal on the surface, but something underneath doesn't add up, tell me in the comments. I want to know if you listened to it or ignored it. I ignored it at first, that's the truth. Because ignoring it was easier than asking questions I might not want the answers to. Back then, the silence from my dad felt explainable. He had a new life, a new family dynamic, a house to manage, a wife running a business, a daughter preparing for college. It made sense on paper. So I kept doing what I had committed to. $1,050 every month. Automatic, predictable, reliable. like a utility bill. Except I wasn't living in that house. I hadn't even stepped inside it since the day we signed the paperwork. And that's something I need you to think about for a second. If you were sending over $1,000 every month into a house you didn't live in, would you ask more questions? Or would you assume everything was being handled fairly? I assumed. That was my mistake. The first real crack showed up in something small, a call that didn't go through. It was a Sunday. I remember because Sundays are quieter on base. Less movement, less noise. More time to think. I called the house around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Vanessa answered. Same tone as always. Controlled. Pleasant. She's resting, Marissa. It's been a long morning for her. I hesitated. Is she okay? Just tired. I'll let her know you called. Something in her voice felt rehearsed. Not fake, just prepared. Like she had said that exact sentence before. I hung up. And for the first time, I didn't feel reassured. I felt managed. That night, I checked my bank records, not because I suspected anything specific, just because I suddenly realized I had never actually looked closely. 48 payments, $1,050 each, $50,400 total, sent into that account. I stared at the number longer than I expected to, because numbers don't lie. They just sit there, waiting for you to decide what they mean. And that was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not yet. Just awareness. I started calling more often. Different times. Early mornings, late evenings, weekdays, weekends. Vanessa still answered most of the time. Always calm, always polite. Always with the reason why my grandmother couldn't come to the phone. She's in the shower. She's asleep. She stepped out. I'll tell her you called. After the 7th time in 2 weeks, I stopped believing it. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because I didn't have anything solid. And I don't move without something solid. Instead, I did something quieter. I called my Aunt Judith. She picked up on the first ring. Marissa, everything okay? I kept my voice neutral. I have a question about the house. A pause, the kind that means she already understands more than you've said. What kind of question? If they decided to sell, what would that process look like with me on the deed? Another pause, longer this time. They can't complete a sale without your signature, she said. Not legally. What about listing it? They could list it, but it wouldn't close without you. I leaned back in my chair. Okay. And if I wanted to know the current value of my share? You can request an equity position from the lender. They are required to notify all parties. I let that sit. And then I asked the question that mattered. Would they know I asked? Yes. That was all I needed. I didn't tell her about the calls, or Vanessa, or the silence. Not yet. Because I wanted to see what would happen if I just watched. A week later, something else happened. Something small, but it confirmed everything. Lila posted a photo. Public. Instagram. New kitchen. Granite countertops. Custom cabinets. Fresh paint. Caption said, "Finally upgraded." I zoomed in on the image. That wasn't the house we bought. Not the original condition. Those upgrades weren't minor. That was at least $18,000, maybe more. And suddenly, the math didn't make sense anymore. Because I hadn't been told about any renovations. Not one. And if you're co-owning a property, major upgrades matter. They affect value. They affect equity. They affect everything. I sat there looking at that photo, and for the first time, the question formed clearly. What else don't I know? That's when I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call. I didn't text. I just adjusted. I booked the flight. Labor Day weekend, 3 months before everything broke open. I picked the date carefully, close enough to the holidays that nobody would question a visit. Far enough that I could prepare. I didn't tell them, because I wanted to see the house as it really was, not as they described it, Not cleaned up for me. Not explained. Real. At the same time, I started documenting everything. Payment history, messages, call logs, dates, times, patterns. Not because I was planning something, but because I didn't want to be in a position where someone could rewrite the story later. If you've ever had someone try to change the narrative after the fact, you know exactly why that matters. 2 weeks before that 4th of July message, I made the decision. I was going home, whether they wanted me there or not. I told my unit I'd be taking leave. Approved. Everything clean. Everything official. And still, I didn't tell my family. Because by then, something in me already knew. Whatever was happening in that house, they didn't want me to see it, and I needed to understand why. So when that message came in, "Don't come home, you'll just make things harder," it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like confirmation. I wasn't being pushed away emotionally. I was being kept out strategically. And that changes everything. Because if someone is trying to keep you away from something, the question isn't why they don't want you there. The question is, what are they afraid you'll see? I boarded that flight anyway, and by the time I landed in Colorado, I already knew one thing for sure. Whatever was waiting for me in that house was bigger than a misunderstanding. And I wasn't going to knock on that door as a daughter. I was going to walk in as someone who finally understood exactly what she owned. Thanksgiving week, at exactly 9:40 at night, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot 2 miles from my father's house and sat there for 17 minutes without turning off the engine, because once I stepped out of that car, I wasn't going back to not knowing. If you've ever sat somewhere longer than necessary just to delay a conversation you knew would change everything, tell me in the comments. Did you go in or did you leave? I went in, but not the way they expected. I didn't drive straight to the house. I checked into a motel first, paid cash. One night, no name attached to anything they could trace. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone. 7 missed calls from my dad, 3 from Vanessa, 2 voicemails I didn't listen to. They knew. Not that I was in town, but that something had shifted. Because the lender had processed my equity inquiry that morning, and legally they had been notified. That was the first move. Not loud, not aggressive, just visible. I didn't return the calls. Instead, I did something else. I called my grandmother directly. Not the house phone, her personal number, the one she had given me years ago that I had almost stopped using because Vanessa always intercepted everything. She picked up on the 4th ring. "Hello?" Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered, but clear. "Grandma, it's me." A pause. A sharp inhale. "Marissa?" "Yeah." Another pause. Longer this time. "I didn't know if you—" She stopped. "If I what?" "If you still had this number." I closed my eyes for a second. "I call every week, Grandma." Silence. Heavy. Confused. "No, you don't, baby." I felt something in my chest shift. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. "I do. Every Sunday, every Wednesday. Sometimes more." A longer silence. Then softer. "No one ever told me." There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not mistiming, not bad luck. A system. Built quietly. Maintained consistently. And now, exposed. "I'm in town," I said. Another inhale. "You are?" "Yeah, I wanted to see you." "When?" "Tomorrow. Thanksgiving." She didn't answer right away. I could hear something in the background. A television, low volume. Then, "They said you weren't coming this year." "I know." A pause. Then her voice changed, stronger. "Come anyway." I opened my eyes. "Okay, we'll have lunch at 1 o'clock," she said. "Don't be late." I smiled a little. "I won't." We hung up, and for a moment I just sat there, because that conversation confirmed something I had been circling around for weeks. They hadn't just been ignoring me. They had been rewriting me. And I want to ask you something. What hurts more, being left out or being replaced in the story entirely? I already knew my answer. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was nervous, because I was thinking. Running through possibilities, outcomes, scenarios. Not emotional ones, practical ones. By morning, I had already made two decisions. I wasn't going to argue, and I wasn't going to explain. I was going to observe. Thanksgiving Day. I parked one street over. Not in the driveway, not where they could see my car. The house looked different. New siding, fresh paint, landscaping that hadn't been there before. More upgrades, more money. None of it discussed, none of it shared. I walked up the sidewalk slowly, not hesitating, just taking inventory. The new door, the camera above the porch, the small details that tell you how a place has changed. I rang the bell at exactly 12:58, 2 minutes early. Footsteps, quick. The door opened. Lila. She froze, like her brain needed a second to catch up. Marissa? Hey. She didn't move at first. Then she stepped back automatically. You're actually here. Yeah, I walked in. Vanessa appeared almost immediately, dish towel in hand, same as always, controlled, composed. And when she saw me, her face didn't show surprise. It went still, too still. Marissa. Not a greeting, not a question, a statement. Hi, Vanessa. Where's your father? Kitchen, she said. Her eyes were already calculating. I could see it. Adjusting, reframing, rewriting the situation in real time. I walked past her, into the kitchen. My dad was standing at the counter, carving knife in hand. He looked up, and for a split second, there it was. Shock. Then it disappeared, replaced by something tighter. I told you not to come. You did. I set my bag down on the chair. I came anyway. A pause, then from the living room. Marissa? My grandmother. I turned, walked past him without waiting for permission. She was sitting in her chair near the window. Same spot, same blanket, just smaller. I crossed the room and knelt in front of her. Hi, Grandma. She reached for my face immediately, like she needed to confirm I was real. You're here. Yeah, I'm here. She held my hands tighter than I expected and didn't let go. We stayed like that for a few seconds, long enough for the room behind me to go completely quiet. Then voices. Low. Controlled. Vanessa. Richard. Whispering in the kitchen. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew what they were doing. Recalculating. Because I had just walked into something they thought they had contained. We moved to the dining table around 1:15. Everything looked perfect. Set exactly. Too perfect. Like a staged version of a family. There were 10 seats. Mine wasn't originally one of them. I could tell. Vanessa added a plate after I arrived. That's a small detail, but details matter, because they tell you what was planned and what wasn't. We sat, food passed, small talk started, controlled, careful, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. My dad cleared his throat halfway through. Marissa, since you're here. There it was. I didn't look up immediately, just kept my tone even. Yeah? We've been reviewing some options regarding the house. Options. Not a lie, just incomplete. Okay. Given your situation. He paused, choosing his words. You being stationed out of state. We think it would be best to simplify things. I looked at him now. Simplify how? Vanessa stepped in. Smooth, practiced. We just need you to sign a document transferring your share. Simple, clean, no complications. There it was, not even subtle anymore. And I want you to think about this. Would you sign something like that without asking a single question? I didn't answer right away. I reached for my glass, took a sip, then set it down carefully. What's the current value of the house? Silence. Not long, but enough. That's not really the point, my dad said. It is. Another pause. Vanessa smiled slightly, controlled again. Around 380,000, she said, estimated. I nodded slowly. 35% of that is about 133,000. The table went quiet. Not loud quiet, tight quiet. And then I said the one thing that shifted everything. What exactly are you offering me to walk away from that? Nobody answered. Because that question wasn't part of their plan. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a conversation. It was an attempt. And they hadn't expected resistance. But they were about to learn something. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue. Because the moment you ask the right question, the entire situation changes. And they still didn't realize that this was only the first layer of what I already knew. That same Thanksgiving afternoon, at 1:32 p.m., with 10 plates still on the table and a house that smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon, my father tried to hand me a document worth $133,000 and called it a formality. I folded it once. Then I set it back down in front of him without signing a single line. If someone asked you to give up 6 figures in front of your own family like it was nothing, would you call it out or keep the peace? Tell me honestly in the comments, because that was the exact moment the room stopped pretending. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. Marissa, she said, voice soft, measured, almost reasonable. We're not trying to take anything from you. You just asked me to sign away my ownership. I kept my tone flat. That is taking something. It's more complicated than that. Then explain it. A pause. Not long, but long enough for everyone at that table to realize something had shifted. My dad stepped in. We've been covering everything here. Maintenance, repairs, taxes. You haven't been involved in the day-to-day. I looked at him. I've been sending $1,050 a month for 4 years. Silence. Then he said the thing I had been waiting for. That was your choice. There it was, the first fracture, because that sentence only works if nobody at the table understands the full context. I leaned back slightly, not aggressive, just steady. It wasn't a choice. It was part of the agreement when I co-signed. Aunt Judith explained it to both of us. He didn't respond. Vanessa stepped in again. Contribution isn't only financial, Marissa. You haven't been here. You haven't helped with your grandmother. You haven't been part of this household. I nodded once. You're right, and that's because every time I called, I was told she was unavailable. The room went quiet again. Different this time. Sharper. My grandmother Evelyn, who had been silent until now, turned her head slowly. I called, I said again, looking at no one in particular. Every week, sometimes more. I let that sit. Then I asked the question. Who told her I didn't? No one answered. Vanessa looked at her plate. My dad looked at the wall. Lila shifted in her seat, and that silence? That was louder than anything anyone could have said. Because silence confirms what words try to avoid. My grandmother's voice cut through it. Richard. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Have you been telling me she doesn't call? My dad exhaled. Mom, it's not like that. Is she lying? The question landed clean, direct. No room to redirect. He didn't answer. And that was the answer. Vanessa tried again. Evelyn, there may have been some miscommunication. Sit down, Vanessa. It wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. Vanessa sat, because some authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from time, and history, and knowing exactly when to use it. I didn't move, didn't speak, because I didn't need to. The truth was already in the room. My grandmother turned back to me. How many times? At least 40. Her hand tightened on the table. And no one told me? No one answered. Again, and this time, it wasn't just silence. It was exposure. I watched Vanessa carefully, because this is where people change tactics. And she did. Her voice softened, shifted, almost vulnerable. We were trying to keep things calm, not overwhelm you, Evelyn. Your health. Don't do that. My grandmother's voice didn't rise. It sharpened. Don't make this about me. Another pause. Vanessa had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. So she pivoted. Back to me. Marissa, we're just trying to move forward. This house? Let's talk about the house. I cut in, calm, precise, because I had reached the point where the conversation needed structure. What's the current mortgage balance? My dad blinked. That's not relevant. It is if you want me to sign anything. He hesitated. Around $198,000. I nodded. So with a market value of roughly $380,000, there's about $182,000 in equity. I didn't look at anyone. Just let the math sit in the air. My 35% is approximately $63,700 after adjustments. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Because numbers remove ambiguity, and ambiguity is where manipulation lives. You're not factoring in improvements, she said. I am. I saw the kitchen. Another pause. You didn't tell me about the renovations. Because you're not here, she said. Exactly. I looked at her. And that's the problem. I said it simply. No emotion, no accusation, just fact. You made decisions about a property I legally co-own, without informing me. My dad leaned forward. We didn't think it was necessary. That's not your call. The sentence landed harder than I expected, because it wasn't loud, it was final. And I saw it register, that shift, from control to realization, that I wasn't going to play the role they had assigned me. If you were in that seat, would you still be trying to keep things polite? Or would you draw the line right there? Because that was the moment I drew mine. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to change the energy of the room. I'm not signing anything today. Vanessa opened her mouth. I'm not finished. She stopped. Because tone matters more than volume. If you want to sell the house, you can. I won't block it. But my share will be calculated based on a certified independent appraisal and handled through legal representation, not at this table. My dad stared at me. You're making this complicated. No, I picked up my bag. I'm making it correct. That's different. I turned to my grandmother. I'll stay for dessert if you want me to. She nodded immediately. You're not going anywhere. So I sat back down, and we finished the meal. But nothing about that table was the same. Because once the truth is visible, it doesn't go back to invisible. After people started leaving, one by one, the house felt different, quieter, not peaceful, just exposed. My dad caught me in the hallway. We need to talk. We did. Back porch, cold air, no audience. You blindsided us, he said. I looked at him. You tried to remove me from something I legally own. That's not a blindside. That's a response. He ran a hand through his hair. Vanessa's business is struggling. We need to sell, then sell, but not without settling my share properly. A pause. Then he said it. What if we can't pay that right away? There it was, the real problem. Not the paperwork, not the timing, the money. I didn't answer immediately, because this was the first time he had actually said something honest. Then I said something he didn't expect. That's not my responsibility. He looked at me like I had just crossed a line, but I hadn't. I had just stopped carrying something that was never mine. I left shortly after, drove back to the motel, sat on the edge of the bed again. But this time, I wasn't uncertain. I was clear. Because now, I had something I didn't have before. Proof. Not documents yet, but behavior, patterns, intent. And here's the part nobody at that table understood yet. That conversation, that was still only the surface. Because what I was about to uncover next wasn't just about money. And it was going to make everything they had done look small in comparison. 3 days after Thanksgiving, at exactly 8:07 in the morning, I walked into the county recorder's office with a folder that had 52 payment records, one unsigned transfer form, and a question nobody in my family thought I would ever ask out loud. I didn't call ahead. I didn't warn anyone. I just pulled a number, sat down, and waited. If you've ever had to verify something yourself because you stopped trusting the version you were given, tell me in the comments. Did you find what you expected? Or something worse? Because what I found that morning didn't match the story I had been told for 4 years. When my number was called, I stepped up to the counter and asked for the full public record on the property. Address, parcel number, ownership structure, any recorded changes since purchase. The clerk didn't ask questions. She just typed, printed, stamped, and handed me a stack of documents that weighed more than they should have. I sat down at a small table in the corner and started reading. First page, original deed, my name, 35%, clean. Second page, mortgage, unchanged, as expected. Then I flipped to the next section, and that's where things stopped being simple. There was a line item, home equity line of credit, opened 18 months earlier. Amount approved, $85,000. I stared at it, read it again, because that number didn't belong in a conversation I had never been part of. My name was still on the primary mortgage, which meant my credit was tied to the property, which meant any additional lien affected me. And I had never been told, not once, not in a call, not in a message, not even hinted at. I kept reading. Drawn amount, $61,300. Used. Active. That wasn't a small oversight. That was a decision, a deliberate one, made without informing a co-owner. And here's what matters. If you open a line of credit tied to a property that has multiple owners, every owner is supposed to know, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. I sat there for a long time, not reacting, just processing. Because this was different from what I had expected. This wasn't just about selling the house. This was about something already taken. I took out my phone, opened my calculator, ran the numbers again. Estimated home value, $380,000. Mortgage balance, $198,000. HELOC used, $61,300. Total obligations tied to that property, $259,300. Which meant the real equity wasn't what they had implied. It was lower, significantly. And more importantly, it had been reduced without my knowledge. I leaned back in the chair and asked myself one question. What was that money used for? Because that answer would tell me everything. I left the office with copies of everything, stamped, certified, documented. Then I did something very simple. I called Vanessa. She picked up on the second ring. Marissa. Her voice was careful, controlled again. We need to talk about the house. A pause. We already did. Not about this. Silence. Short, but enough. What do you mean? I looked down at the document in my hand. You opened a home equity line of credit. Another pause. Longer. Then, that was for renovations. There it was. Fast answer. Prepared, but not complete. How much? Another pause. Around 50. Wrong. I kept my voice even. The approved amount was 85. You've used over 61. Silence. Heavy now. Different. Because numbers don't leave room to adjust. Why wasn't I informed? We didn't think. No, I cut in. Don't say that. A breath on the other end. Then a shift. Defensive. It was necessary. For what? Upgrades, business expenses, temporary coverage. Temporary. I repeated the word quietly. And suddenly, everything started aligning. The renovations, the boutique losses, the urgency to sell. This wasn't about moving forward. This was about covering something already done. And I asked the question she didn't want. How much of that went into your business? No answer. That was the answer. I closed my eyes for a second. Not out of frustration, just confirmation. Vanessa, I said, very calmly. You use debt tied to a property I co-own to fund something I had no knowledge of. We were going to handle it. By asking me to sign away my share? That's exactly what that was. A pause. Then she changed tone again, quieter, almost tired. We thought it would be easier. There it was. Not a denial, not an excuse, a strategy. And I want to ask you something. When someone says it was easier, who was it easier for? Because it wasn't for me. I stood there in the parking lot, phone in hand, and realized something very clearly. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to bypass me. And those are two very different things. But the outcome is the same. I ended the call without arguing, because I didn't need to. I already had what I needed: documentation, numbers, a pattern. And now, intent. I drove straight to my Aunt Judith's office. She looked at the papers for less than 2 minutes before she leaned back in her chair. Did you authorize this? No. She nodded once. Then this is a problem. Her tone didn't change, but the meaning did. Not a family problem, a legal one. I sat across from her. What are my options? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me something. Do you want to recover your equity, or do you want to challenge what they did? I thought about that, because those are two different paths. One is resolution, the other is confrontation, and both come with consequences. I looked at her. What happens if I do nothing? She met my eyes. Then they continue making decisions without you, and you absorb the risk. Simple, clear, accurate. I nodded slowly. Okay, and what happens if I move forward? She folded her hands. Then we document everything. We request a full accounting, and we make it very clear that your name is not something they can work around. I sat there for a second. Then I said the one thing that defined everything that came after. I want what's mine. Not more, not less, just mine. Judith gave a small nod. Then we do this properly. And for the first time since that message came in, I felt something settle. Not relief, not satisfaction. Just alignment. Because now the situation was clear. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about communication. This was about control. And they had been operating under one assumption for 4 years, that I wouldn't push back. That assumption was about to cost them more than they expected. Because what they still didn't realize was that the paperwork I had just uncovered was only the second layer of what was actually happening. And the third layer was going to bring consequences they couldn't ignore anymore. The following Monday, at exactly 10:16 in the morning, my aunt's office sent a certified letter that forced my father to account for $61,300 he never told me existed. I didn't call. I didn't warn him. I let the paperwork speak first. If you've ever had to stop arguing and just let facts do the work, tell me in the comments. Did it end things, or did it make them worse? Because in my case, it made everything escalate. The letter was simple, deliberately so. Request for full financial accounting tied to the property. Documentation of all liens. Breakdown of HELOC usage. Timeline of expenditures. And one line that mattered more than anything else. Failure to respond may result in further legal action. No emotion, no accusation, just pressure. Delivered professionally, which is always more dangerous than anger. I went back to base that same afternoon. Routine, structure, clarity. The kind of environment where things either make sense or they don't happen. And that contrast hit me harder than I expected. Because back there, everything had been happening without structure, without accountability, without me. My phone rang at 1:02 p.m. My dad. I let it ring. It rang again, then again. 7 times total. Same pattern as before. But this time, I wasn't avoiding the call. I was choosing the timing. He left a voicemail. I listened to it once. Marissa, what is this? His voice wasn't angry, not yet. It was controlled, confused, which meant he hadn't processed it fully. "Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I waited. Because this part matters. When people lose control of a situation, they go through stages: confusion, denial, then pressure. The second call came from Vanessa. Different tone. Immediate. "Sharp, what are you doing?" I answered that one, handling my position. "You didn't need to involve lawyers. You opened a $61,300 line of credit without telling me." A pause, then, "We were going to explain." "When?" Silence. "That question doesn't need to be repeated." "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said. "No." I leaned against the wall outside the admin building. "I'm correcting it." Another pause. Then she shifted again. Frustration now. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to us right now?" "Yes," I said it simply. "That's the point." She exhaled hard. "Marissa, you don't get to use my name, my credit, and my equity as a buffer, and then ask me to stay quiet when I notice." The line went quiet. And that silence, that was the first real crack in her control. Because she didn't have a clean response, only justification. And justification doesn't hold up under structure. "We needed the money," she said finally. "For what?" "You already know." "Say it." A longer pause. Then, "The business." There it was. Not partial anymore, not implied, confirmed. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, just completion. Because now I had all three pieces: the debt, the amount, the purpose. That's when I asked the next question. "Did Dad know the full amount?" Silence. Longer this time. Then, "He trusted me to handle it." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Because this is what happens when someone builds control quietly. Other people stop asking questions, even when they should. I ended the call after that. No argument, no escalation. Because I didn't need to push. They were already reacting. And reacting means they were behind. That evening, my aunt called me. They responded. "Already?" "Yes, that was fast." Which told me something important. They were worried. "What did they say?" She paused for a second. Then, "They're asking for time." Of course they were. Time is what people ask for when they don't have a solution yet. "How much?" 30 days. I shook my head slightly. "No." She waited. Then I said it clearly. 14. Another pause. Then, "I'll relay that." "Good. Because here's the thing. Delays benefit the person who already used the money, not the person tied to the risk. And I wasn't carrying that risk any longer than necessary." That night, I sat on my bed and looked at everything again. The payments, $50,400 over 4 years. The equity, around $63,000 before adjustments. The debt they added, $61,300, without telling me. And I asked myself something I hadn't asked yet. What if they couldn't pay it back? Because that changes everything. Because then, this isn't just about fairness, it's about exposure. And exposure has consequences. Legal ones, financial ones, permanent ones. 2 days later, I got the answer. Not from them, from my aunt. She called at 9:18 a.m. "There's more." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" She didn't rush. She never does. The HELOC wasn't just used for the business. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the phone. "Go on." "There were withdrawals, large ones, not tied to invoices, not tied to renovations, cash movements, unaccounted." I didn't speak, because I already understood what that meant. And then she said the sentence that changed everything. "We're going to need a full forensic breakdown. Not a summary, not a conversation, an investigation." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just mismanagement. This wasn't just bad decisions. This was something else, something deeper. Because when money starts moving without records, it's not a mistake. It's a pattern. And patterns don't stay hidden forever. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the base. Everything structured, everything accounted for. And then I asked the only question that mattered now. How bad is it? My aunt didn't answer immediately, which was already an answer. Then she said, bad enough, that they're not going to be able to fix this quietly. And that's when I understood something very clearly. Up until now, they had been trying to manage me. From this point forward, they were going to have to answer for what they did. And they still didn't realize that the next step wasn't going to happen in private anymore. 2 weeks after that call, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, I stopped answering every message from my father and let the silence do what arguing never could. No calls, no texts, no explanations. Just nothing. If you've ever gone completely quiet on someone who expected you to react, tell me in the comments. Did it make them reflect? Or did it make them panic? Because in my case, it made them unravel. Silence is uncomfortable for people who rely on control. Because control needs feedback, it needs reaction, it needs something to adjust against. And when you remove that, they start guessing. And guessing leads to mistakes. That was the phase we had entered. My dad called 3 times a day for the first week. Morning, afternoon, late evening. Same pattern, same urgency. Vanessa didn't call as much, but when she did, her messages were different, short, direct. We need to resolve this. This is getting out of hand. You're making this worse. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I didn't have answers, because I didn't want to give them anything to work with. Instead, I let my aunt handle everything. Structured, documented, controlled, exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. At work, nothing changed. 0600 formation, reports, inventory, movement schedules. The predictability of it all became something I leaned into. Because outside of that, things were shifting quickly. The 14-day deadline was almost up, and they hadn't provided a full accounting, not even close. Partial statements, vague explanations, numbers that didn't align, which told me everything I needed to know. They weren't struggling to explain it. They were trying to reshape it. And that's when I made the second decision. I wasn't going to help them do that. I called my aunt. We move forward. She didn't ask what I meant. She already knew. Formal escalation. Yes. A pause. Then, once we initiate this, there's no going back to quiet resolution. I know. And I meant it. Because at that point, quiet had already cost me 4 years. That same afternoon, the next set of documents went out. Formal demand, full financial disclosure, legal notice of potential breach of co-owner rights, language tightened, consequences outlined, no ambiguity left. And this time, they didn't call. Not immediately, which was different, which meant they were thinking. And thinking means they understood. 3 days later, my grandmother called. Saturday, 12:03 p.m., right on time. Hi, baby. Hi, Grandma. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it, something heavier. I heard from your father. I didn't respond, because I wanted to hear what she would say next. He says things are complicated. I sat down on the edge of my bed. They are. A pause, then, are you okay? That question. It mattered more than anything else anyone had said to me in weeks. Yeah, I'm okay. Another pause, longer. Then, did they do something wrong? I could have answered that 100 different ways, explained the numbers, the documents, the legal structure, but I didn't. Instead, I said the simplest version. They made decisions without me, and now I'm fixing that. Silence. Then, good. That caught me off guard. Good? Yes. Her voice sharpened slightly. You don't let people use you just because they're family. I leaned back slowly. Because that sentence, that was the first time anyone in that family had said it out loud. And I want you to think about this. How many problems in families exist because no one is willing to say that one sentence? We talked for another 20 minutes. Not about the case, not about the money. Just normal things. Weather, food, her neighbor. And it felt real, unfiltered, for the first time in a long time. After we hung up, I realized something. I wasn't just separating from my father. I was reconnecting somewhere else. And that mattered, more than I expected. The next shift came from somewhere I didn't anticipate. Lila texted me, 3 days later, 7:42 p.m. "Hey, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a second, because that hadn't happened in years. I replied, "About what?" A pause, then, "I didn't know." Simple. No defense, no excuse. Just honest. I called her. She picked up immediately. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. I didn't know about the loan. I didn't interrupt. I didn't know about the amount either. Still didn't speak. I only found out after Thanksgiving. That part mattered, because it meant the control wasn't just directed at me. It was internal, too. "I thought it was just renovations," she said. I said nothing. Then she asked something I hadn't expected. "Are you going to sue them?" Direct, uncomfortable, real. I took a breath. "I'm going to protect what's mine." A pause, then, "That sounds like yes." "No," I said it clearly. "That sounds like accountability." Silence, then, "Mom's freaking out." I almost smiled. Of course she was. Because this wasn't a conversation she could control anymore. "She says you're trying to ruin everything." I leaned back. "I'm trying to stop things from being hidden." Another pause. Then Lila said something that stayed with me. "I think things were already ruined." That was the first honest sentence from her. And it changed how I saw her. Not as part of the problem, just part of the environment. We talked for a while after that. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. When the call ended, I didn't feel angry. I felt distant, not cold, just separate. And that's the difference. Because anger keeps you tied to something. Distance lets you move. That night, I didn't check my phone, didn't think about the case, didn't replay the conversations. I just slept. And for the first time since all of this started, I slept without tension. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't explaining. I had moved into something else. Quiet, deliberate, unavoidable. And what my father still didn't understand was that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means preparation. Because while he was trying to figure out how to fix what had already happened, I was already preparing for what was about to happen next. And that next step wasn't going to stay inside the family. 3 days after I stopped answering them completely, at exactly 2:18 in the afternoon, my aunt scheduled a formal mediation request and copied both attorneys on an email that made it clear this was no longer a private family matter. I didn't hesitate. I approved it within 2 minutes. If you've ever had to decide whether to keep something inside the family or bring it into the open, tell me in the comments. At what point do you stop protecting people who never protected you? Because that was the line I crossed. The mediation was set for 2 weeks later. Neutral office, downtown Colorado Springs. Professional setting. No kitchen table, no emotional framing. Just documents, numbers, and accountability. Exactly where this belonged from the beginning. In the days leading up to it, I didn't contact my dad. I didn't contact Vanessa. Everything went through attorneys. Every message filtered. Every response documented. And something interesting happened. They became more careful. Shorter emails, less emotion, more controlled. Which told me they were finally understanding the situation. But understanding doesn't fix damage. It just changes how people react to it. My Aunt Judith started preparing everything. Payment history, $50,400 total contributions. Ownership percentage, 35%. Property valuation. Updated comps closer to $392,000 now. HELOC documentation. $61,300 drawn. And then, the part that mattered most, the unaccounted withdrawals, roughly $18,000. No invoices, no receipts, no explanation. That wasn't a mistake. That was exposure. And exposure doesn't stay contained. The night before the mediation, I sat at my desk on base and reviewed everything one last time. Not to memorize it, to simplify it. Because the goal wasn't to overwhelm. The goal was to be clear. And clarity wins more often than aggression. I wrote one sentence on a piece of paper. I will not argue. I will only confirm facts. Then I folded it and put it in my pocket. The next morning I flew in. Early flight, minimal luggage. Same approach as before. No announcement, no warning. But this time, they knew I was coming. The mediation office was on the 4th floor of a glass building that overlooked the city. Clean, neutral, quiet. The kind of place where people resolve things they can't fix on their own. I arrived 10 minutes early. My aunt was already there. Stack of files, calm expression. Same as always. You ready? Yeah. She nodded once. Good, because this isn't about winning, it's about positioning. I understood that, completely. We went into the room at 9 a.m. Rectangular table, 4 chairs on each side, water glasses, notepads, no distractions. My dad and Vanessa were already there. That was the first time I had seen them since Thanksgiving, and the difference was immediate. My dad looked tired. Not physically, structurally, like something had shifted underneath him. Vanessa looked tighter, still composed, but less controlled than before. Because this environment didn't belong to her. This wasn't her space to manage. This was neutral ground. And neutral ground removes advantage. Their attorney sat beside them, calm, observing, already assessing. The mediator introduced himself, set the structure, explained the process. Then he said something that defined the entire room. This is not about emotion. This is about resolution. Good, because emotion was never going to help them here. We started with basic positions. Their side spoke first, framed it as a misunderstanding, miscommunication, timing issues, financial pressure, all the words that soften something without actually addressing it. I didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened, because people reveal more when you let them talk uninterrupted. Then it was my turn. I didn't stand, didn't raise my voice. I just opened the folder and started. 4 years, $1,050 monthly, $50,400 total, 35% ownership, property valued at approximately $392,000, mortgage balance $198,000, HELOC drawn $61,300, unaccounted funds $18,000. I closed the folder. That's the situation. Silence. Not dramatic, just complete. Because numbers don't argue. They don't escalate. They just sit there and force everyone else to respond. The mediator looked at their attorney. Would you like to respond? He cleared his throat. We acknowledged the figures. That was step 1, acknowledgement, which matters more than denial. Then he added, however, the intent was never to exclude. Intent doesn't change outcome. I said it calmly, because that's a sentence that cuts through everything. And I want you to remember this. Intent is what people say. Impact is what actually happened. We're here because of impact. Another pause. Then my dad spoke, for the first time. Marissa, we were trying to fix things. I looked at him. By not telling me? He didn't answer. Because there wasn't a version of that worked. Vanessa tried next. We thought we could stabilize everything before involving you. I nodded slightly. That's not your decision to make. Simple, direct, final. And that's when the shift happened. From explanation to defense. Because now they weren't trying to justify what happened. They were trying to minimize it. "We can settle this quickly," their attorney said. "Buyout, clean transfer, no further action." There it was, the offer. But here's the thing, timing matters, and this offer was late, too late. Because they weren't offering fairness, they were offering damage control. "What's the number?" my aunt asked. Their attorney glanced at my dad. Then, $40,000. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Low, calculated, testing. I didn't react immediately, just looked at the mediator, then back at them. No. One word. No explanation, no negotiation, just no. Because some numbers don't deserve discussion. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Marissa, that's a reasonable—" "No." I repeated it, calm, unmoved. Because here's something important. The moment you start negotiating from a number that's already wrong, you've already lost ground. My aunt stepped in. Independent appraisal, full accounting, equity calculated correctly. That's the only path forward. The mediator nodded slowly. That seems appropriate given the documentation. And just like that, the structure shifted from negotiation to correction. But what they still didn't realize was that this wasn't the hardest part for them. The numbers. That was manageable. What was coming next? Wasn't. Because the moment that $18,000 in unaccounted cash got addressed, this was no longer just a financial dispute. It became something else. And that's the moment everything started to fall apart in a way they couldn't control anymore. 47 minutes into that mediation, at exactly 9:47 in the morning, my aunt slid a single page across the table that accounted for $43,300 and left $18,000 with no explanation. No receipts, no invoices, no paper trail, just absence. And absence in a room like that is louder than anything you can say. If you've ever watched someone realize they can't explain their own story anymore, tell me in the comments. Did they double down? Or did they break? Because what happened next wasn't immediate. It was slower than that, and worse. The mediator looked at the page, then at their attorney, then at Vanessa. "This portion," he said carefully. "What documentation supports these withdrawals?" Vanessa didn't answer right away. She looked at my dad. My dad looked at the table. That was the first tell. Because when people know the answer, they don't look for it somewhere else. Their attorney stepped in. "We're still gathering, supporting—" "No," my aunt's voice, calm, controlled, already ahead. "These withdrawals were made over a 6-month period. Cash movements, multiple transactions. If documentation existed, it would already be available." Silence. The kind that settles. The kind that forces someone to either step forward or step down. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. It was operational. That word again. Vague, flexible, useless. "Operational how?" the mediator asked. "Business expenses." "Which ones?" A pause. Then, "Inventory." I tilted my head slightly, because now we were getting somewhere. "Then there should be invoices." Another pause, longer. "We don't have all of them organized." That's when I spoke. First time since the numbers. "You withdrew $18,000 in cash, and you're telling me there are no records?" My tone didn't change, but the room did. Because now it wasn't just documentation. It was credibility. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. "We didn't expect this to become public?" I finished it for her. Another pause, then, "Legal," she corrected. I nodded once. Same difference at this point. My dad finally spoke again. We were under pressure. There it was, the first real crack. Not denial, not explanation, just pressure. And I want to ask you something. When someone says they were under pressure, does that make what they did acceptable? Or does it just explain why they did it? Because those are not the same thing. The mediator leaned back slightly. Pressure doesn't remove the requirement for documentation. That sentence landed clean because it removed the emotional argument completely. Back to structure, back to facts, back to accountability. Their attorney shifted in his seat. If necessary, we can produce it now, my aunt cut in. Another silence. And this one was different because it wasn't about what they would say next. It was about what they couldn't. Vanessa looked at my dad again, and this time, he didn't look back. He just stared at the table. And that's when I knew. He didn't know the full story either. He knew about the loan. He didn't know about this. And that changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just external control. It was internal fracture. I leaned forward slightly, still calm, still measured. Where did the $18,000 go? No accusation, no emotion, just a question. Vanessa inhaled slowly, then exhaled, and for the first time since I had known her, she didn't look controlled. She looked cornered. It wasn't all at once, she said. That wasn't the question. Where did it go? A longer pause. Then, some of it was for the business. Some of it was personal. That word, personal, undefined, unstructured, dangerous. My aunt didn't move. Can you define personal? Vanessa hesitated, and hesitation, in that moment, said more than anything else. Expenses. Which ones? No answer. My dad finally looked up. Vanessa? His voice was low, tight. What does that mean? She didn't respond, and that silence, that's when everything shifted, because now the problem wasn't just between me and them. It was between them. And once that happens, control is gone. I sat back in my chair. Didn't push, didn't press, because I didn't need to. The room was already doing the work. The mediator spoke again. If funds were used in a way that cannot be accounted for, this becomes a different category of issue. There it was. Not just financial, not just civil, potentially something else. Their attorney straightened slightly. Let's not escalate unnecessarily. It's not escalation, my aunt said. It's classification. That's the difference. And that's a line you don't come back from easily. My dad rubbed his face with one hand, then looked at Vanessa again. You told me everything was for the house. She didn't answer. You said the loan was for renovations. Still nothing. And that's when it happened, the shift, from denial to fracture, from control to exposure. I didn't interrupt, didn't move, because this wasn't my moment to push. This was their moment to realize. And realization is always quieter than confrontation, but it cuts deeper. The mediator looked around the table. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Nobody argued. Nobody objected. Because everyone needed it. Vanessa stood up quickly, too quickly, walked out without looking at anyone. My dad stayed seated for a second, then stood more slowly and followed her. Their attorney remained, exhaled once, then looked at us. We may need to restructure this entirely. My aunt nodded once. That would be appropriate. I didn't say anything, because the structure had already changed. The room just hadn't caught up yet. And I want you to think about this. At what point does the situation stop being something you can fix quietly and become something that follows you publicly? Because we had just crossed that point. And what they still didn't understand was that the next phase wasn't going to be about negotiation anymore. It was going to be about consequence. And consequences don't stay inside a room like that. 10 minutes after that break was called, at exactly 10:12 in the morning, Vanessa walked back into the room with a different posture, a different tone, and a decision that changed the direction of everything. She didn't sit right away. She stood at the end of the table, looked at her attorney, then at my dad, then finally, at me. We need to resolve this today, not tomorrow, not later. Today. If you've ever watched someone realize they've run out of space to maneuver, you know that moment. Tell me in the comments, did they fight harder? Or did they finally tell the truth? Because this was the moment she chose. The mediator gestured for everyone to sit. Let's proceed. Vanessa sat down, hands folded tightly in front of her. No more soft tone, no more framing, just direct. The remaining funds were not used for the house. Silence, immediate, complete. My dad turned his head slowly toward her. What? She didn't look at him. They were used to cover losses, the boutique, operational gaps, and... She paused. And that pause, that's where everything shifted. Say it, my dad's voice. Lower now. Not controlled, not calm, just tight. Vanessa exhaled. And then, I made some decisions that didn't work. That sentence. Careful, still controlled, still trying to minimize. I leaned forward slightly. Which decisions? Because we were past general statements. Now it was specifics. She hesitated. Then, inventory expansion, supplier contracts, short-term loans, all stacked, all compounding. And then, I moved money to stabilize things, without telling you. That last part wasn't directed at me, it was directed at him. And that's when the room changed. Because now this wasn't just my case, it was their reality. My dad stood up, chair scraping against the floor. You said everything was covered. Vanessa stayed seated. I thought I could fix it before it mattered. Before it mattered. That's the sentence people use when they think they still have time. You used $61,000 from a loan tied to this house. His voice was rising now. And I watched it happen, the stages. Denial had already passed. Now we were in blame. You told me it was renovations. It started that way. Started. That word hung there. Then where did it go? Vanessa didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation, that's when the final piece clicked. Because hesitation means there's more. And my aunt saw it too. Is there additional debt we're not aware of? Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Credit lines. How much? Another pause, then, around 30. The room went still. Not just quiet, still. Because now the numbers had expanded beyond the house, beyond the loan, into something else entirely. My dad sat back down slowly, like his body was catching up to what his mind had just heard. You said we were fine. Vanessa didn't respond, because there wasn't a version of that could be defended anymore. The mediator stepped in. Let's stay focused on the matter at hand. But it was already too late, because the matter had expanded. And once it expands, you can't compress it back. Their attorney cleared his throat. Given these disclosures, we should discuss settlement terms immediately. Translation? Damage control. Fast. Before this moves further. My aunt nodded slightly. Then let's be clear. Full accounting, independent appraisal, equity payout based on verified numbers, and a written acknowledgement of undisclosed financial actions. Vanessa's head snapped slightly. Acknowledgement? Yes, my aunt didn't move. Because this isn't just about numbers anymore. It's about record. And record is what follows you. My dad looked between them. What does that mean? It means, I said it calmly, that what happened is documented properly. Not softened, not rewritten. Accurate. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no control left in his expression. Just realization. You're really doing this. I held his gaze. I'm finishing this. That's different. And that's one of those sentences you don't forget. Because it doesn't sound aggressive, but it ends things. Vanessa leaned forward again. If we agree to the payout, this doesn't go further. My aunt didn't answer immediately, because that question had layers. Then she said, that depends on full compliance. No omissions, no delays, no additional surprises. Vanessa nodded slowly. Then, we can do that. But I watched her carefully, because agreement under pressure is not the same as agreement with control. And that matters. The mediator began outlining terms, timeline, verification process, appraisal scheduling, payment structure. All structured, all formal, all unavoidable. My dad sat there silently through most of it, not interrupting, not arguing. Because he had moved into the next stage. Victim. This isn't what I thought was happening. He said it quietly, to no one in particular. And that's the stage people go to when they realize they've lost control of the narrative. They step out of it, try to separate themselves from it. But it doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change who was responsible. I didn't respond, because I didn't need to. The facts were already doing that. By the time the session ended, everything was in motion. Appraisal scheduled, financial review formalized, settlement structure drafted. No more gray areas, no more assumptions, just process. As we stood to leave, Vanessa spoke one last time. Marissa. I paused, turned slightly. We never meant for this to, I cut her off. Intent doesn't change outcome. You said that. I nodded once. Then you understand. And I walked out. No anger, no satisfaction, just completion. But here's the part none of them were ready for yet. Because while they were focused on settling this, on closing it, on containing it, there was one piece still unresolved. The documentation, the formal record. And once that process finished, what they had tried to keep quiet was going to exist in writing, permanently. And that's something you don't get to take back. 32 days after that mediation, at exactly 4:26 in the afternoon, the final appraisal came in at $401,000 and locked my equity at a number they could no longer negotiate down. $68,900. Verified. Documented. Unavoidable. And that was the moment everything stopped being discussion and became obligation. If you've ever watched someone run out of options one step at a time, tell me in the comments, what did they do when there was nothing left to argue? Because by then, they weren't arguing anymore. They were complying. The process moved fast after that, faster than I expected, because once professionals take over, emotion gets removed. Structure takes over. And structure doesn't hesitate. The appraisal firm walked the property. Full report. Comparables, adjustments, condition notes. Everything aligned. My aunt reviewed it. Their attorney reviewed it. No disputes. Which told me something important. They didn't have room to push anymore. The numbers were clean. And when numbers are clean, the only thing left is action. The next step was the payout structure. 2 options, full buyout or forced sale. My aunt laid it out clearly. If they pay, this ends clean. If they don't, we move to sale. And sale would not be in their control. I already knew my answer. Buyout. Because I wasn't trying to take the house. I was trying to take back what was mine. Nothing more, nothing less. The agreement came through 3 days later. Formal, detailed, precise. $68,900 to be paid within 14 days of signing. No extensions, no conditions, no adjustments. Plus, written acknowledgement of undisclosed financial activity tied to the property. That clause mattered more than the money. Because money resolves a situation, record defines it, and record lasts. My dad signed first, electronically. No call, no message, just signature. Vanessa signed 18 minutes later. That timing told me everything. Not hesitation, not reflection, just inevitability. I signed last, not because I needed time, because I wanted to be certain. Once that signature goes through, there is no version of the relationship that returns to what it was. And I understood that completely. So I took a breath, read everything one more time, then signed. And just like that, it was done. Or at least, that's what it looked like. The wire transfer came 4 days later. I was standing in the supply room when I checked my account. $68,900. Clean, complete, final. I didn't react, didn't celebrate, didn't call anyone, because it didn't feel like winning. It felt like something being returned, something that had been delayed, not lost, just taken longer to come back. And I want to ask you something. Does getting what's yours back ever feel like victory? Or does it just feel like balance? Because for me, it felt like balance. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from my dad. First one since the mediation. We should talk. I looked at it for a long time. Then I typed one sentence. There's nothing left to discuss. And I meant it. Because here's the truth. Closure doesn't come from conversation. It comes from clarity. And I already had that. He didn't respond. Vanessa never reached out. Not once. And that silence? That was different now. Not controlled, not strategic, just empty. Which is what happens when the structure holding something together collapses. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my aunt. It's done. I knew what she meant. The acknowledgement? Filed, official, recorded. Which meant everything that had happened now existed in writing. Not opinion, not memory, fact. And that changes things. Because once something becomes record, it follows you in ways people don't think about. Financially, legally, reputationally, quietly, but permanently. That same week, Lila called me. Not text, called. I answered. Hey. Her voice was softer, different. It's really over? Yeah. A pause. Then, they're selling the house. Of course they were. Because without my share, without the structure they had built around me, the math didn't work anymore. Okay. Another pause. Then, Mom's not doing well. I didn't respond immediately, because I didn't know what response would even mean. Not financially, just everything. I nodded slightly, even though she couldn't see it. I hope she figures it out. That was all I said. Not cold, not harsh, just honest. Because I wasn't responsible for fixing what I didn't break. We talked for a few minutes after that. About her plans, about normal things. And when we hung up, I didn't feel pulled back in. I felt separate, clear. And that clarity, that's what I had been building toward the entire time. Not revenge, not punishment, just separation from something that no longer functioned the way it should. That night, I sat on my bed and looked at my account again. $68,900, plus the $1,050 that had stayed in my pay the last 2 months. I thought about the 4 years, the calls, the silence, the way things had been managed around me. And I realized something. This was never just about money. It was about position. Whether I was someone who could be worked around or someone who had to be accounted for. And that difference changes everything. But here's the part nobody talks about. What happens after everything is resolved? After the documents are signed. After the money is transferred. After the conflict ends. Because that's where the real shift happens. And for me, that shift wasn't loud. It was quiet. But it was permanent. 6 months after that wire hit my account, on a quiet Sunday at exactly 11:08 in the morning, I sat on a wooden bench outside a small coffee shop in Denver with a $6 latte in my hand and a phone that no longer carried any weight when it lit up. No missed calls, no tension, no expectation, just quiet. If you've ever reached the point where silence finally feels like peace instead of absence, tell me in the comments. What changed for you? Because for me, it wasn't the money. It was the boundary. By then, the house was gone, sold, closed, new owners. No connection left to me. Not legally, not emotionally, just gone. And that mattered more than I expected. Because for years, that house had been a tie, a reason, a justification for staying connected. Even when the connection wasn't real anymore. Once it was gone, So was the last excuse. My dad never called again. Not once. No birthday, no holiday, no follow-up. And the truth is, I didn't notice right away. Because I had stopped waiting. And that's the shift. Not when they stop reaching out. When you stop expecting them to. Vanessa stayed exactly where I left her. No contact, no apology, no explanation. And I didn't go looking for one, because closure doesn't come from the person who caused the problem. It comes from deciding you don't need anything from them anymore. That's a different kind of freedom. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else. Lila moved to Boulder. New job, entry-level marketing, small apartment. She called me once a month, sometimes more. We met twice. Coffee. Nothing heavy. Just normal. And that mattered. Because not everything needed to be cut off, just the parts that were built on control. My grandmother, Evelyn, she became my constant. Every Saturday, 12 p.m., same call, same rhythm. She didn't ask about the case anymore, didn't bring up the past. We talked about simple things, weather, neighbors, food, and sometimes nothing at all. Just shared silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I visited her twice, sat in the same chair by the window, held her hand the same way I did that Thanksgiving, and every time, it felt real. Not managed, not filtered, just real. And that's something I didn't realize I had been missing until I had it back. At work, nothing changed, which was exactly what I needed. Structure, routine, clarity. I got promoted 4 months after everything closed. Staff sergeant. Nothing dramatic, just the next step. Earned, clean, clear. I moved into a slightly better apartment off base. Nothing flashy, just mine. I bought a desk. Solid wood, simple, sat near the window. And that's where I handled everything now. Finances, planning, life. On my terms. And I want to say something clearly, because this part matters. I didn't win. They didn't lose. That's not what this was. This was correction. Balance. A system that finally worked the way it was supposed to. And here's the truth most people don't say out loud. Revenge is loud. Justice is quiet. And quiet lasts longer. One evening, about 2 months after everything ended, I opened a small box I had kept in my drawer. Inside was a ring. Not expensive, not flashy, just a simple band my mom used to wear. My aunt had given it to me after everything was over. Said my mom had kept it aside years ago, for me. I hadn't worn it yet. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't feel like I had reached the moment. That night, I did. I put it on, looked at my hand for a second, then went back to what I was doing. No ceremony, no emotion, just placement. And that felt right. Because some things don't need to be announced. They just need to be accepted. A few weeks later, I ran into someone from my past. Mutual connection. They asked about my family. Simple question. Casual. I answered just as simply. We're not in contact. They waited for more, an explanation, a story. I didn't give one, because I didn't need to. And that's another kind of freedom. Not explaining your boundaries, just living inside them. Before I finish this, I want to ask you something. If you had to choose between keeping the peace or keeping your self-respect, which one would you protect? Because at some point, you don't get to have both, and the choice you make defines everything that comes after. I chose self-respect, quietly, deliberately, and I didn't look back. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it felt familiar, if you've ever had to draw a line with someone who thought they could move it, leave a comment. Tell me your story. I read them, all of them. And if you're still here, subscribe. There's another story coming. Different situation, different choices, same question underneath. What do you do when the people who should protect you are the ones you need to protect yourself from? Take care of yourself, and don't ignore what you already know.